And now we're going to reach our third step of demand. So demand for a single item is going to be one bag of Doritos, and a change in price would cause a movement along the demand curve. For each price, there's going to be a certain amount of or quantity that is demanded. Step 2 is all the Doritos in the United States or in any economy. So I know if something of Piper, one of my shifters, increases or decreases, then I would have an increase in demand. Now, let's go to third step of demand, step 3, and that's going to be aggregate demand. So aggregate demand is equal to sig x. So that is also how we add up our GDP is equal to sig x. So if we take all of our consumption, all of our gross private investment, all our government spending, and all of our net exports, and add those up, you get aggregate demand. And our aggregate demand graph is going to be downward sloping as well, but it's also all of the items in the economy, all goods and services. That's kind of our third step. So we have our short run aggregate supply, and we have our long run aggregate supply, and that is at full employment, with the x-axis being GDP. GDP represents all the aggregate spending or all the aggregate income that's in the economy. Now this particular one is at full employment equilibrium or long run equilibrium. We have our price level on the y-axis, just like we had price for a single item on the y-axis, just like we have prices for all the Doritos and the single price, so always on the x-axis. And quantity is going to be the same thing. Remember, GDP is our prices times our quantities, and if we have real GDP, we'll just simply subtract the inflation. So now, anytime we have changes to this, we're going to look at changes to sig x. So if aggregate demand in the entire economy is going to be changing, something would have to happen to sig x. So if our consumption goes up, if interest rates are low and investment goes up, if our government goes and spends more money, which they're really good at, that goes up. If any of these goes up, jump across the equal sign, and the same thing has to happen. Then we can have our increases or decreases, and then of course our shifts that would go with that. So if this were to happen, our aggregate demand would increase to the right, and that would cause price level to go up, and of course GDP to go up. Then we would be producing at more of an inflationary gap right there. Now if something bad were to happen, the opposite, so if something decreases on sig x, then aggregate demand would decrease. Remember, aggregate demand is the same way we have our expenditure model of GDP. So if that happens, we would actually shift to the left. You don't have to draw these both on the same graph. I'm just doing it to save some time. So that would be a decrease. That would put us into a recession because GDP is decreasing. And if GDP is decreasing, we're not making as much stuff. So then we'd have a shift to the left of that. So that right there is our third step of demand, aggregate, the big picture, everything in the United States.